Because of our relationship with Israel, we, the United States of America, are complicit in this genocide. Whoever is president will support Israel unconditionally because of the power of the lobby.
Taking center stage today is John Mearsheimer, a renowned political scientist and an influential scholar in international relations. Professor Mearsheimer has been vocal in the public discourse surrounding the wars in Gaza and Ukraine and joins center stage to apply his theories to the ongoing war on Gaza and Israel's aspirations in the region. He also weighs in on the 2024 US presidential election and the minefield that is US foreign policy. Professor John Mearsheimer, welcome to Center Stage.
I'm glad to be here.
Everyone knew you in the political science sphere. Do politicians actually listen to you as well?
I think that hardly anybody in the West listens to me, certainly in my own country, the United States.
If they had listened to you, those politicians, where would we be today?
Well, I think that the main area where I weighed in, where I thought I might have some influence, but I didn't, was on the Ukraine issue. I made the argument for a long time that NATO expansion into Ukraine was a prescription for disaster, because I understood full well that the Russians viewed Ukraine becoming part of NATO as an existential threat. So I started advocating loudly and clearly in February of 2014 that the United States should cease and desist from trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. But we, of course, did the opposite. We continued to pursue NATO expansion, and the end result is that in February of 2022, the war broke out. I think if people had listened to me, in all honesty, and not expanded NATO or tried to expand NATO into Ukraine, we would have avoided that war.
You were part of three main schools of international relations post-Cold War. There was a kind of rivalry between yourself, your offensive political realism theory versus Fukuyama's more optimistic about the eventual triumph of liberal democracies and Huntington's famous clash of civilizations. Up until recent events, scholars would argue that your theories sound very logical, but they remain untested.
Well, as you know, in the 1990s, it looked like Frank Fukuyama was right. You know, he had argued that we had reached the end of history, great power politics was no more, we were all going to live happily ever after. And in fact, Frank Fukuyama said at the end of his article on the end of history that the biggest problem that we would face moving forward was boredom. But that theory of international politics, that theory that explains that we're going to get a peaceful world, no longer looks credible. With regard to Sam Huntington, he made the argument that we have this civilizational clash taking place, and one of the central features of his argument was Islam versus the West. And at the time of 9/11, it looked like he was correct to many people. I never believed that because I think the concept of civilizations does not take you very far. It's not an analytically powerful concept. I believe the most powerful ideology in the world is nationalism. The planet is filled with nation states. Nation states are the embodiment of nationalism. And I think that to argue that civilizations are what really matter and that wars take place across civilizations and not among states from different civilizations is wrong-headed.
So where does your theory stand now on the Israel-Gaza-Lebanon war? How do you dissect this conflict now?
The Palestinians live inside Greater Israel, right? There's no Palestinian state fighting against an Israeli state. My theory applies to interstate conflict, and it mainly applies to conflict between great powers. And in the Middle East, we're not talking about great powers. And indeed, with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're not even talking about an interstate conflict. You had a first intifada in 1987, you had a second intifada in 2000, and what happened on October 7th is just another manifestation of this conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis inside of Greater Israel.
You don't believe anymore in the two-state solution.
I thought that the two-state solution was possible many years ago.
What killed that prospect for Palestinians?
I think that the Israelis have never had any interest in a two-state solution from the get-go. I mean, the conventional wisdom in the West, certainly in the United States, is that the Israelis have generously offered the Palestinians a state of their own on a number of occasions, and on each one of those occasions, the Palestinians have rejected that generous offer. I think this is nonsense. This is simply not true. The Israelis have never offered the Palestinians a viable state of their own, and they have never had any interest in that. We're at a point today where it's virtually impossible to imagine Israel giving the Palestinians a state of their own. I think there are really only two possibilities on the table. One is the continuation of apartheid Israel, or ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And it started in 1948 with the Nakba. The second big cleansing was in 1967. And there is some cleansing taking place now, although the Israelis have not been able to move large numbers of Palestinians out of Gaza or the West Bank. And hopefully they won't be able to do that.
How does any person in the American administration see this genocide unfolding, see these horrible images, and just continue with this passive, almost supportive policies towards Israel?
I wonder myself. I mean, they're under tremendous pressure from the Israel lobby to support Israel no matter what. So if Israel commits a genocide, as it's doing in Gaza, there's no question that the lobby is going to great lengths to pressure politicians and policymakers to support Israel completely. And most of them are doing that. I'm amazed at how few people have stood up and said that this is unacceptable, that this has to stop. I mean, you take someone like Samantha Power, who's the head of the USAID. She made her reputation as a scholar on genocide, and she made it clear that she was horrified by genocides and horrified by the fact that the United States had not done enough in the past to shut down or to prevent genocides. And here she is in the Biden administration in a very prominent position, not protesting what's going on in Gaza. You would just expect human beings who see things like this happening to stand up and say enough is enough.
How does the US administration rationalize being a supporter of a genocide? How is this rational politically to the US?
Many people don't use the word genocide. So many people believe that it's not actually a genocide that is taking place. A lot of people just bury their head in the sand. They don't want to see the evil that is taking place in Gaza, and therefore they keep their mouths shut.
So technically, narrative is a big player.
There's no question that the narrative matters. The argument that the Iranians are the master puppeteers who are the principal cause of all of this trouble that we see today. I think this argument is nonsense. The Iranians are not the principal cause of this problem. The Israelis are the principal cause of this problem. But there's a narrative in the West that tells you the opposite argument, that blames the Iranians. This is a conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and it's an unfair fight, right? The Israelis are Godzilla and the Palestinians are Bambi.
Where is Israel taking the region?
Israel has this dream that it's going to remake the region. It's going to put an end to apartheid Israel by cleansing the Palestinians. It's going to defeat Hezbollah and remove Hezbollah as a threat. And with regard to Iran, Iran will be neutralized as well. And the United States will play the key role in doing that. The Israelis understand full well they're not in a position to sort of do great damage to Iran and neuter Iran. But the United States can do that in their mind. The United States can deal with the Iranian nuclear program.
Israel is continuously seeking to exert its power in the region, but it also talks about increasing its security. Yet past events have shown that it only decreased it. How can one rationalize this balance between power and desire for security from Israel?
Israel is ideologically committed to a greater Israel. The Israelis believe that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip belong to them, that this is sacred territory. And they furthermore understand that the Palestinians are a problem. They're a roadblock to them creating a homogeneous Jewish state that includes Gaza and the West Bank. So they think they are justified from an ideological point of view in removing the Palestinians from that territory. And they make an argument about security that goes along with that ideological argument. When I was young and I first started studying the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israelis fought wars against the Egyptians, against the Syrians, against the Jordanians. These were conventional wars, and the Israelis were very adept at fighting those wars. And they did not need much help from the United States or any other country to win those wars. If you think about the world that Israel lives in today, it's no longer worried about fighting a conventional war against Egypt or a conventional war against Syria. It's fighting against resistance groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that are armed with missiles and rockets. It's fighting against Iran, and it's not fighting a conventional war against Iran. It's dealing with rockets, missiles, and drones coming from Iran. The Israelis are now in a position where they have to depend heavily on the United States. One does not want to underestimate how important it is for Israel today to have military support and economic support from the United States. There's no way Israel could be fighting these wars without lots of support from the United States. This is a fundamentally different situation than Israel was in back in the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and even in the 1980s.
Your latest book has a very interesting title, How States Think. How does Iran think regarding this now?
Neither Iran or the United States want to fight each other. It's the Israelis who have been trying to pull the Iranians and the Americans into a fight.
So they're being rational?
Oh yeah, I think the Iranians were being rational. From an Iranian point of view, the smart way to deal with Israel is indirectly. It's to support Hezbollah, support Hamas, support the Houthis in Yemen, and so forth and so on. Support the militias in Iraq and in Syria as well. But from an Iranian point of view, you don't want to get directly involved unless you absolutely have to. And the Iranians thought, I believe, up until October 1st, that they could appease the Americans, appease the Israelis, they could get some sort of deal with the Americans so that Iran would avoid getting pulled into the conflict. It was on July 31st that Israel killed the Palestinian leader in Tehran. And it was not until October 1st that Iran retaliated. It's a long period of time. And that, I believe, is because the Iranians were looking for a way not to have to retaliate. The Americans were telling them, we'll get a ceasefire in Gaza. And once we get a ceasefire in Gaza, you, Iran, will not then have to retaliate against Israel. But of course, the Americans did not get a ceasefire. The Israelis went out and assassinated Nasrallah. And the Iranians understood enough is enough. So on October 1st, the Iranians retaliated with 180 plus ballistic missiles aimed at Israel. The Israelis have said they're now going to retaliate, and what the Iranians have said is, okay, you retaliate, we're going to counter-retaliate. And if you counter-retaliate, we will counter-retaliate. The Iranians understand that they have to go up the escalation ladder because there is no cooperating with the Americans and the Israelis to shut down this conflict.
How far can Iran go? What are the tools it has?
The Iranians can use their ballistic missile inventory to destroy oil fields and oil refineries in the region and cut off the flow of much of the oil out of the Middle East to the rest of the world. This would have catastrophic consequences for the international economy. And the mere threat of this has significant deterrent value. The Iranians, as you know, have been enriching nuclear material up to 60%, and it's quite easy for them to enrich up to 90%, which would give them enough fissile material for a few bombs. If Iran was to get a bomb, there are two possible consequences that are profoundly worrying. The first is you would undoubtedly get more proliferation in the Middle East. The Saudis, for example, have said that if Iran gets a bomb, we will get a bomb. And if Iran and Saudi Arabia have bombs, I would imagine the Turks, the Iraqis, and the Egyptians will not be far behind. So you would have a lot of nuclear proliferation in all likelihood if Iran gets a nuclear bomb. Can you imagine a crisis between a nuclear-armed Iran and a nuclear-armed Israel? That is really scary.
You mentioned the importance and the weight of the Israeli lobby on the US elections and the US foreign policy. What does AIPAC want from that president? What does Netanyahu want from that president? And in the end, what any of these two candidates will do?
What AIPAC and the lobby want from the United States, no matter who is the president, is unconditional support for Israel. They want the United States to back Israel no matter what Israel does. What Israel wants is exactly the same thing. Israel wants the United States to support whatever Israel does. If Israel needs more weapons, the United States should give Israel those weapons. If Israel needs diplomatic support at the UN or wherever, the United States should give Israel that diplomatic support. So the goals of Israel and the Israel lobby are synonymous. It doesn't matter whether Donald Trump is elected or Kamala Harris is elected. Whoever is president will support Israel unconditionally because of the power of the lobby.
As an American, how do you feel that your country's foreign policy is not actually your own?
Because of our relationship with Israel, we, the United States of America, are complicit in this genocide. So I think from a moral point of view, as well as from a strategic point of view, is America's unconditional support of Israel is wrong in the extreme. It's not in America's strategic interest to support Israel.
This brings me back to the question, how is this rational to the US? Is America being rational in this?
No. No, it's very important to understand that states do not always behave rationally. And in terms of the U.S. relationship with Israel over time, and certainly with regard to the U.S. relationship with Israel today, this is not an example of rational behavior. This is not strategic behavior.
If you got the chance for the next US president to listen to you, actually, what would you advise them to do?
Well, I would argue that the United States should go to great lengths to alter its relationship with Israel in fundamental ways. I think when Israel's interests line up with America's interests, the United States should support Israel. And when they don't, we should put enormous pressure on Israel to change its behavior. And I think the United States clearly has the leverage to tell Israel that it has two choices. One, it can have a greater Israel, but that greater Israel will have to be a democracy, one person, one vote. Or we can have a two-state solution, which will mean putting an end to the settlement enterprise, moving the settlers back into Green Line Israel, and giving the Palestinians a viable state of their own. So that'd be the first thing I would do. And then the second thing I would do is try to change relations with Iran, because that will foster stability in the greater Middle East. And it is in our interest, in America's interest, to have more stability in the broader Middle East, in addition to putting an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Where do you see Netanyahu leading the region and the US with it?
Whether Netanyahu's in power or someone else is in power in Israel at this point in time doesn't matter at all. The Israelis are hardline in the extreme, and that's not going to change. If anything, Israel's going to become more hardline on the Palestinian issue with the passage of time. Israel is in a deep hole, and what they're doing is continuing to dig. And the belief is that they're going to fix this problem. They're going to create a new Middle East where Israel lives happily ever after. I don't think that's going to happen.
What about the Palestinians in all of this? We talk now about Iran, the US, Israel. What about the Palestinians? What's their future going to look like?
Well, the only agency that the Palestinians have is to rebel. I mean, there's not much else the Palestinians can do. They can resist. The Palestinians don't have a lot of outside support. The Houthis and Hezbollah have been fighting against Israel and fighting against the United States in defense of the Palestinians. But the Palestinians don't have many allies in the world. And they're really in a terrible situation. And this is why I worry greatly about their future. I mean, we're talking about a genocide in Gaza. Just think about that. The Israelis are bent on making Gaza unlivable. Well, if the Palestinians can't live in Gaza and they can't exit Gaza, that means they're going to die in Gaza. And of course, the Israelis are not just interested in cleansing Gaza, they're also interested in cleansing the West Bank. And the Palestinians in the West Bank are in good part defenseless, as are the Palestinians in Gaza, especially when they go up against Godzilla, which is the IDF. So the Palestinians are in an extremely, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, they are in an extremely difficult position.
And it seems like a lonely position. What about Arab states? If leaders wanted to actually defend Palestinians and protect their lives at least, what can they do?
The problem is, given the military balance in the region, there's not much that Arab leaders can do. What is Jordan going to do? Declare war against Israel? Come to the rescue of the Palestinians? The fact is that Jordan does not have the military capability to intervene. Furthermore, a country like Jordan, and this is true of Egypt as well, are heavily dependent on American economic aid for their survival. That gives the United States and, in effect, Israel great leverage over both Jordan and Egypt. So there's not much they can do.
Russia is signing a strategic cooperation agreement with Iran, similar to the one they signed with North Korea. They declared that they have a special partnership with China since 2022, the Ukrainian war. How is it going to change or to manifest in the region in the midst of a war?
It's the American threat to those four countries that has forced them to work together. As far as the Middle East is concerned, the two countries that matter greatly for the Middle East are Russia and Iran. And what you see happening is the Russians and the Iranians are now beginning to work together. The United States and Russia are both involved in the Middle East. And the Russians view the United States as a mortal enemy, as they should. The Russians are fighting in effect, the United States in Ukraine. So the Russians want to help the Iranians, and I believe they are now helping the Iranians. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens if Iran decides to develop nuclear weapons. If Iran begins to go down the nuclear road, will Russia resist? And will Russia say, no, you cannot do that? That has been the case in the past. You want to remember that the Russians played a key role in putting together the JCPOA. That was the arms control agreement involving Iran that slowed down the Iranian nuclear program.
You simplify your main theory on your website by explaining, and I quote, "I am a realist, which means that I believe that the great powers dominate the international system and they constantly engage in security competition with each other, which sometimes leads to war." You come from the greatest power, which sometimes makes its war in my region. I come from this region where most of the wars mostly happen. Is it the fate of my people in my region? How can we change that?
The Middle East is not going to be a peaceful region for a long time to come. 8 days before October 7th, Jake Sullivan, who was the national security advisor for President Biden, said he had not seen the Middle East so peaceful. But what he didn't understand was sitting underneath the surface were these powerful volcanic forces that were just waiting to erupt. And of course, they began to erupt on October 7th. And we've had a series of eruptions since October 7th.
What about the youth? They seem to have higher standards than us, higher moral values than us, and a greater sense of justice. Do you see that they're going to change the world?
I think there's no question when you look at young people today, they're much more attuned to human rights. They're much more attuned to sort of doing the right thing from a moral point of view. It's no accident that when you look at what's been happening in the West in terms of protests against Israeli policy in Gaza, that young people have been leading those protests, and there's much more dissatisfaction, much more anger with Israel among young people in the West than there is with older people. The problem is that older people control the policy-making positions, and it'll be a long time before those young people become policymakers. In the West, it's not clear that public opinion matters very much for how policymakers operate. You want to understand, if public opinion in the West governed how Western leaders dealt with Israel over Gaza and over the West Bank, we would have a fundamentally different policy. But up at the elite level, the elites remain almost 100% committed to supporting Israel no matter what. So it's going to take a long time before those young people move into policymaking positions. And one could even argue, it's depressing to say this, but as they move up the ladder into policymaking positions, they are likely to fall into the influence of the lobby and change their perspective.
Thank you very much, Professor John Mearsheimer.
You're more than welcome.